I'm going to talk a little bit about establishing pastures in a couple of different scenarios. And I guess, our goal is quality pasture. Got a picture of a pasture here in midsummer. There's lots of growth. When I was there, there's 18, 24 inches of good lush grass for those cows to eat. That's the kind of feed that we want, because intake in animals is based on bite size. Cattle eat about 30,000 bites a day. And so the way to get better intakes is get a bigger bite. It's kind of like eating ice cream. When the bowl ice cream's in front of you, you don't grab the smallest spoon you can find. We want to use that principle here. So what is our starting point? And are we trying to seed a new pasture out of a field that's been an annual crop? So we're taking a cropping field and seeding it to pasture. Sometimes we're in that situation. Have we got a run-out pasture that we want to reseed? Or do we have a low productivity pasture that just needs some improvement? So each of those situations, you need to ask yourself, what is it I'm trying to achieve and what am I working with? And each scenario is going to be a little bit different. The other factors is, what is the soil fertility in that field? And what's the drainage? And of course, very few pasture fields have any stones in them, so we don't have to worry about that. And then the next one, so that's the field. What are we going to graze? How are we going to use this field in your system? If you've got lactating females, we need really high quality forage. If we've got growing animals, we need high quality forage. If we've got pregnant females, then likely we're more interested in quantity than quality. We still need reasonable quality, but it's quantity that becomes more important. And we likely want to extend the grazing season. So moving it either earlier or later, in most cases later. So then we need to take that into consideration. And when do we want to graze this field? Early in the season, which would mean we need early season grasses. Do we want late season and stockpile? If we're going to graze that field early in the year, then we want species that get started really early in the spring, such as orchard grass would be one grass that is really early to start. Trefoil, really slow to start in the spring, but works really well for late season and stockpile grazing. So those are things you kind of have to balance out in your planning and programming for that pasture field. Mid-season grazing, and when I said mid-season, I'm thinking late July and August. So kind of that summer slump for cool season grasses. If that's the period we want to hit, then we need to find something that will do well in that time frame. This is the kind of pasture that I like to see. Starting to see flowers on the alfalfa, a few flowers on the clovers. The grasses are just coming into head. So we've got plants that are reaching that beginning of that maturity stage. And so we've got high quantity, still high quality, and that makes for excellent grazing for the animals. It also makes it great for the plants because they've grown through to that far. So they've got a big root system under them. They're not being deprived of where we've got it really short, that they don't have the energy in the plant. So ideal type of grazing situation. So what species to consider when you're seeding down a pasture? And again, you've got to come back to that first couple of slides. I like to see lots of legumes in a pasture. The legumes tend to hold their quality as they mature better than the grasses do. They produce nitrogen that will feed the grasses. They tend to be high in energy and just excellent from a grazing standpoint. Alfalfa works well in a pasture situation. We have lots of concern about bloat. Most of the concern I get from people calling me, asking me about bloat, are from people that haven't tried to graze alfalfa. People that graze it learn to manage the bloat issue and they see the really high productivity they can get with a high alfalfa-based pasture. So again, that's for lactating females, growing animals. It's high quality, high production pasture. Clovers, and again, we have a bloat issue with the clovers, but manage it. And I like to see at least 40% legume in that pasture. And there's nothing wrong with 50, 60, or 70% legume if you're willing to manage it and consequently get the production from it. White clover, low growing, excellent pasture legume. It spreads, which is a nice advantage over the other legumes which don't spread. The white clover sends out a stolon and will start up new plants adjacent to the parent plant, and high quality forage. Red clover, relatively short-lived, a couple of years likely is what you'll get out of red clover. And the nice thing about red clover, it's likely the easiest to frost seed of any of the legumes we've got. It's a big seed, it's a hardy seedling, and so if you want to just get some extra legume into a pasture, I would broadcast some red clover in there. If I was seeding a pasture down right from scratch, in other words, tilled it up and seeding it, I likely would not use red clover in that situation because it's only going to last a couple of years. And Alsite does well in sort of poor drainage situations, lower pH situations, not used a lot, but it does have its spot to fit in. Then trefoil, non-bloating, excellent grazing legume, slow to start in the spring, slow to recover during the year. So it takes a longer recovery time, but a very productive legume. And non-bloating is a great feature. Sainfoin, you're going to read a little bit about sainfoin in the popular press. There's been some breeding work done out at Lethbridge by Syria Cura with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. He has a new variety called Mountain View that looks really impressive. But we haven't grown sainfoin in Ontario. Its growth habits are similar to alfalfa. It's non-bloating, but it's quite a bit lower yielding than alfalfa, and I haven't seen any of it in my travels. It'll be interesting. I think we'll see in the next couple of years a little bit more of it, but it's one that's been around for a long time. I think at this point people are looking at its attributes rather than the negative side of sainfoin, and we'll see how it progresses. And then vetches. Usually we don't seed vetches, but if you get them in a pasture, excellent forage quality, and again, another legume that puts nitrogen back into the soil. So those are the legumes that we work with. Likely the alfalfa, the white clover, and the trefoil are the three main ones in a pasture situation. Just a shot of trefoil. It needs to flower and set seed at some point during the year, and if it doesn't, we seem to see the stand thin out fairly quickly. I think trefoil is a short-lived perennial needing to reseed itself, and that takes about 60 days. Here you can see some seed pods in this this trefoil, and that was about 60 days that it took to get to that stage. This actual slide is out of my front lawn. I put up with a lot of wrath from my wife for growing a hayfield in the front lawn. But I wanted to see how long it took to get those seeds. And it was about 60 days, which is a fairly long time in a pasture rotation system. But excellent quality feed. And here's one of the reasons why I really like alfalfa in a pasture system. This slide is from 2012 when we had we had a drought. That's what we had. It was really, really dry. This is August the 17th that this picture was taken. You can see the growth on the grass and see the alfalfa. It's got a big root system. It picked up moisture. It kept going. And the middle of August, we've got lots of growth there where the grasses had done nothing in that time frame. And that's the real advantage of alfalfa, in my mind, in a pasture system, is it gives us that late midsummer and late summer growth that we wouldn't otherwise have. The grass species to look at seeding down, I'm a big fan of orchard grass. It starts growing early in the spring. It regrows faster than any of the other grasses. It's reasonably dry weather tolerant. I think of all the species we've got to work with, it has the best combination of growth and quality and productivity. Meadow brome works well in a pasture system as opposed to the smooth brome. Smooth brome doesn't have much regrowth, so we get the first cut off of, or first grazing off of smooth brome, and then we don't get a lot of regrowth. Meadow brome and orchard grass, once they're grazed off or cut off, whatever, the seed heads removed, they stay vegetative for the rest of the year. So orchard grass, you let it grow and head out, and it turns to straw and sticks and it's junk. So you got to get it just before the seed head emerges or just after, and then from then on, once that seed head's removed, it's going to produce leaves only for the rest of the year. And it makes both meadow brome and orchard grass make excellent pasture. I got Timothy in the middle of this list. I don't know what happened. In my mind, Timothy belongs on the bottom of the list because there's no regrowth. Timothy does well in May and June. There's no July and August for Timothy. So, and in pasture, we got lots of May and June growth. So, you know, it will fill in a little bit, but you're not going to get summer growth out of Timothy. Festolium, we haven't seen a lot of Festolium in Ontario, but there is some coming in through the seed companies. Festolium is a cross between ryegrass and fescue. And it comes in all kinds of shapes and types. It could be a cross between Italian ryegrass and creeping red fescue, or it could be perennial ryegrass and tall fescue. So any combination, a ryegrass and a fescue, and so the Festoliums have different characteristics depending on their parentage. But the good ones have all the positive attributes. So high quality forage, good regrowth, and something that I think as we see some newer species come in, or new varieties, I think we have a real opportunity to add those. Tall fescue, consider that for a pasture that's for late season grazing or for stockpile grazing. Tall fescue has a rough leaf. Animals don't like to graze it, but if they've rooted through some snow to find some green leaves, they're so impressed that they don't care if they're a little bit rough. You know, it's, if you're hungry enough, then anything will do type thing. The leaves hold their quality in the wintertime very well. It's a very productive grass, and it works well with trefoil if you want that late season, October, November, December grazing, or even on into January. And then the last one's reed canary grass, can be very productive, does really well in wet locations. I would not suggest using reed canary grass on tile drain fields. If it gets well established, it'll also establish in the tile lines, and that's not a good story. It'll plug up the tile lines. So if it's on tiled land, reed canary may have a place. It's got to be managed properly. It has the biggest root system of all the grasses that I've listed there. So if you can get it established in a really dry area, and that's a big challenge, but if you can, it'll do fairly well there because of a massive root system. So those are the grasses. You kind of have to match them up with the legumes depending on what it is you're trying to do. The variety selection, we've had performance trials in Ontario for a lot of years, and they're available in this performance trials brochure. And if you go to goforges.ca, www.goforges.ca, the performance trials are there, and plus a whole lot more of forage information that you can read through, and trial work, and some of the old fact sheets that OMAP thought were out of date. GoForges were smart enough to put them in PDFs and put them up on the website. So lots of good information there. Performance trials where the registration system has been changed and it's kind of in limbo at this point. With the registration system, we no longer need independent performance data for variety registration, and so the Ontario Forage Crops Committee is kind of trying to figure out what the future ahead is and whether they'll be doing any trials at all or not. So, frost seeding to rejuvenate a pasture, so that's something that should be done tomorrow. It was good you came here today, but tomorrow is frost seeding day. Add some legumes to an existing pasture. Look at clovers and trefoil as the ones to use. Alfalfa doesn't frost seed very well. Grasses generally don't frost seed very well. So I would work with red clover, white clover, and trefoil. If you're going to seed red clover, 4 to 5 pounds to the acre. White clover, 1 to 2 pounds. Trefoil, 2 to 4 pounds. Frost seeding works most of the time, but not all the time. So rather than put on more seed, I'd rather see you do it this year and again next year. Get it on when there's still a little bit of snow on the ground or at least frost in the ground. And as the sun shines down and melts the ground, or melts and you get a little bit of mud on the surface, the seed tends to get embedded in that mud and we get a little better establishment. So late March, very, very early April is the time to do that. And preferably in a field that you've grazed down quite short the previous fall so that they minimize the competition to the new seedlings. Just a shot of a broadcast seeder on the back of an ATV. Another way to rejuvenate a pasture is bale grazing. And Josh talked a little bit about that this morning. Feed hay on a run-out pasture. You're putting nutrients back in the field. The cattle will tend to tramp those nutrients in a little bit. And with the added nutrients from the hay that you're feeding and the added activity, you can see significant improvements in a run-out pasture by doing that. Just feeding on the pasture, and that avoids handling the manure back in the barnyard. So a little bit on fertilizer strategies. Really important to soil test and know what the fertility is in the field. I see a lot of soil tests from pasture fields that are really low. And if there isn't nutrient there, you're not going to get very good response from the plants. Liming for pH, if you've got low pH, phosphorus and potassium levels need to be at least in the medium range, and then nitrogen for extra growth if you don't have the legumes. Soil sampling we want to sample sort of 25-acre parcel or a management-sized area. If you've got a 25-acre field that's got a high section and a low section, then treat it as 2. Take a couple of core samples per acre so we get lots of samples. There are lots of samples. The plow layer weighs about 2 million pounds. So the top 6 inches weighs about 2 million pounds. You're going to take a little core sample about 1 inch in diameter and 4 to 6 inches deep out of that. Mix it all together, send it off to the lab, and they're going to use about a teaspoon of that to come up with what you need in your soil. So it's important to have that sample be representative. And I've listed the website there where OMAFRA recommended labs are located, and that's on the OMAFRA website. Soil test every 3 or 4 years. If the pH is lower than 6.5, consider liming. And most of the time in Ontario, we don't have a pH problem, but once in a while we do. And if you do, you're going to get a significant response to bringing that pH up into that 6.5 or higher. Phosphorus soil test of 12 to 20 parts per million, and potassium soil test of 120 to 150 parts per million. Just a shot of what happens with pH when this is the availability of these nutrients And in that 6 to 8 range, most of them are pretty good. But when we get below 6, you can see how it tapers off. Potassium availability is really low. Phosphorus availability drops off. Calcium drops off. And once in a while at a high pH, we'll get problems. But it's mostly these at the low pH. And that's where we'll get a response to liming if we're in that 4, 5 to 6 range in the soil pH. So for perennial legumes, we would like to have a target pH of 6.5. Grass pastures, target pH of 6, and these are minimums. That's on coarse textured soils, and on fine textured soils, perennial legumes, alfalfa, again 6.5. Other perennials 6. Trefoil and clover can do fairly well at lower pHs than alfalfa can. But we want to try and get that pH up above 6 or 6.5. Just a slide showing how much lime it takes. If we've got a buffer pH of 1 and we want to get to a pH of 6, we need 2.2 tons of lime per acre. So it takes a fair bit of lime to raise the pH, something that, ideally you work the limestone in, or ground lime. If it's a permanent pasture situation, spread it on the surface and let the earthworms and other soil activity along with rainfall work it in. Just a phosphorus soil test. We've got a soil test of 8.8 to 9 parts per million. We want to put about 70 kilograms per hectare or 65 pounds of phosphorus, P2O5, on at planting time, and on established pastures we need some extra to keep them going. If we get up in this 20 range, which was what I mentioned before, then a little bit at seeding, and we shouldn't need any extra. And this table is right out of the agronomy guide. Same thing with potassium. We get down into these low levels. We need a fair bit of, medium amount of potassium here at seeding, but then we need a lot in the late summer, early fall to keep those legumes going and provide some winter hardiness to them. So seedbed preparation now, if we're working a field up and seeding it down, if you're going to do no-till and you can seed down a direct seed in a no-till situation, then weed control and residue management are key. If you're doing tillage, you want to seed into a firm, smooth seed bed. And quite often when we see failures in legume or pasture establishment or forage establishment, it's because the seed bed was too light and fluffy and there's too much range in how deep the seed's planted, and then we get all kinds of problems. We want that seed about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep, and in most cases, if you've done tillage in that field, you likely should roll the field or pack the field before you plant, so that when you walk on the field, your foot should leave an imprint but not a hole in the dirt. So walk on it and you can see where the footsteps are, but there's no holes there where you've sunk down into the soil. And that is key, getting the seed into a firm seed bed. 3 different planting systems, no-till drill, conventional drill, and a brilliant seeder, all can do a very good job of establishing a stand. Weed control. Control the perennial weeds before you seed down, sort of in that preparation period. Annual weed control, if you're going to spray early. First to third trifoliate leaf on the legumes is the recommendation. And that, if you want to go 1/2 to 1, the earlier the better. The better response you'll have. If you're using a cover crop with your seeding down, consider taking it off as green feed in late June, early July. That opens up the canopy and we'll get much better growth on the forage seeds that we've planted, and that'll give you some extra feed in that cropping year. I would suggest oats at about 40 pounds per acre as a cover crop if that's what you want to do. If we get the seeding rate up too high, then it's just a lot of competition for those small forage seeds that are in the bottom. Cut it off at the late boot, early heading stage. Make green feed out of it, so don't leave it laying on the field trying to dry. Wrap it up, get it off the field, and then don't graze the plants until they're well anchored. So if you're seeding a pasture field, you want those plants well anchored. Cattle tear the plant off, so if you've got a little plant that's this high with not much root system and it gets torn off, it will never regrow. So make sure they're well rooted. And maintaining a new pasture, managed grazing, rest and recovery. We've heard about that all morning, and that is the key to keeping a pasture productive. You need that rest and recovery time for the pasture plants. Don't overgraze and maintain fertility.